There's a place on this planet less explored than the surface of the moon. Fewer human eyes have witnessed it directly than have witnessed the far side of another world. It sits beneath the western Pacific Ocean, roughly 7 miles straight down, in permanent, absolute darkness, under pressure so extreme that it could crush a submarine like an empty soda can in less than a second, if that submarine's hull failed even slightly. And yet, against every intuition you have about what crushed by darkness and pressure should mean, it is not empty down there. It is not lifeless. It is not simply mud and silence. There is something living at the very bottom of that trench, in the coldest, most hostile, most inaccessible environment on Earth. And for most of human history, we had absolutely no idea what it was, because almost no one had ever been there to look. This is the story of the Mariana Trench, the deepest place on our planet, and the small handful of people across generations who were reckless enough, brilliant enough, or simply curious enough to go looking for what waits at the bottom. Let's start with where this place actually is, because it is not some remote, imaginary void on the edge of a map. The Mariana Trench sits in the western Pacific Ocean, near the Mariana Islands, not far from the island of Guam, curving for over 1 in 50,000 miles along the ocean floor like a scar left by something ancient. Its deepest point, a slender crescent-shaped valley within the trench, known as the Challenger Deep, plunges to a depth of nearly 11,000 meters, close to 7 miles beneath the surface of the water above it. To understand what that number actually means, consider this. If you took Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, and dropped it into the Challenger Deep, its peak would still sit more than 2 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. The tallest point on our planet would completely disappear, swallowed whole with over a mile of black water left sitting above where its summit used to be. We are not talking about a deep valley. We are talking about a wound in the Earth's crust so profound that our highest mountain would vanish into it without a trace. Humanity did not even know this place existed until surprisingly recently in our history. In 1875, a British Royal Navy vessel named HMS Challenger, on a 4-year scientific expedition to survey the world's oceans, lowered a weighted sounding line into the water near the Mariana Islands, expecting to find the seafloor within a reasonable distance, the way they had almost everywhere else on their voyage. The line kept falling and falling. Thousands of feet passed, then thousands more, the crew watching the rope disappear into water so deep that no one on board had any real precedent for what they were witnessing. By the time the weight finally touched bottom, the ship's crew had recorded a depth of over 4,000 fathoms, close to 8,000 meters, a number so far beyond anything previously measured on Earth that it effectively announced the discovery of what we now call the Challenger Deep, named in honor of the ship whose crew first proved it was there. For decades afterward, that single sounding remained little more than a curiosity in scientific journals, an almost unbelievable number attached to a place nobody had any practical way of actually visiting. That changed dramatically in 1960. On January 23rd of that year, a strange, bulbous vessel called the Trieste, a bathyscaphe designed specifically to withstand crushing deep ocean pressure, began a descent into the Challenger Deep, carrying 2 men, United States Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and Swiss oceanographer and engineer Jacques Piccard. Neither of them knew, with total certainty, that they would survive the trip. Nothing built by human hands had ever attempted to reach that depth before, and the vessel itself was largely an experimental machine. Its float chamber filled with gasoline for buoyancy, its crew compartment a small steel sphere designed to resist pressures that would, at that depth, exert roughly 8 tons of force on every single square inch of its surface. As they descended, nearly 5 hours passing in the confined, freezing dark of the crew sphere, something happened that would have ended most expeditions immediately. At a depth of around 9,000 meters, the crew heard and felt a violent shudder pass through the vessel, followed by the unmistakable sound of something cracking. One of the outer viewing windows, a thick pane of plexiglass fitted into the vessel's hull specifically to withstand the crushing pressure of the descent, had fractured. Not shattered completely, which would have ended the dive and very likely ended both of their lives in an instant, but cracked badly enough that the entire vessel shook from the force of it. Piccard and Walsh had a choice in that moment that most people will thankfully never have to make. Turn back immediately, with the safety of the surface still hours away, or continue downward into the one place on Earth less forgiving of mechanical failure than anywhere else in existence. They chose to continue. Nearly 5 hours after they began their descent, the Trieste finally settled onto the silty, flat floor of the Challenger Deep, at a depth of approximately 10,912 meters, becoming the first vessel in human history to reach the deepest point of Earth's oceans. They spent barely 20 minutes there. 20 minutes, after years of engineering and a 5-hour descent through crushing darkness before beginning the long ascent back toward the surface, back toward sunlight, back toward a world that had no real precedent for what these 2 men had just accomplished. And then, for more than 50 years, nobody went back. Think about that gap. Humanity reached the deepest point on our own planet in 1960, and then simply did not return there again for over half a century. In that same stretch of time, 12 different astronauts walked on the surface of the moon, 12 human beings stood on another world, hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth, while the deepest place on our own planet, less than 7 miles beneath the waves, sat completely unvisited, its full mysteries locked away by the sheer difficulty and expense of ever getting there again. It would take until March of 2012 for a human being to return, and when it finally happened, it was not a government space agency or a naval research program that funded the mission. It was a filmmaker. James Cameron, the director behind Titanic and Avatar, had spent years and a substantial personal fortune developing a new submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger, engineered specifically for a solo descent to the bottom of the Challenger deep. On March 26, 2012, Cameron piloted that vessel down alone, becoming the first human being in history to make a solo journey to the deepest point on Earth, reaching a depth of roughly 10,900 meters. He spent several hours at the bottom, far longer than Piccard and Walsh had managed over 5 decades earlier, capturing footage and collecting samples of an environment that had gone almost entirely unstudied since that first fleeting 20-minute visit in 1960. It would take one more leap in 2019 for humanity's relationship with the deepest place on Earth to fundamentally change. That year, businessman and explorer Victor Vescovo, piloting a submersible called the DSV Limiting Factor as part of an ambitious program called the 5 Deeps Expedition, did something no one had ever done before. He did not simply visit the Challenger deep once. He dove there repeatedly across multiple trips within the same expedition, reaching depths of roughly 10,927 to 10,928 meters, slightly deeper than either of the 2 previous manned missions, and setting a new record for the deepest confirmed dive by a crewed vessel in history. Over the following years, that same submersible carried a growing number of scientists, researchers, and even a few passengers down to the same crushing depths, meaning that in the span of just a few years, more human beings visited the bottom of the Challenger deep than had in the entire previous half-century combined. And what Vescovo found waiting for him at the bottom of the deepest place on our planet was not the pristine, untouched wilderness you might expect from some place so remote and difficult to reach. Drifting along the seafloor at a depth so extreme it takes hours just to reach in a specially engineered submersible, he spotted something floating past his viewport that had absolutely no business being there. A piece of plastic waste resembling a candy wrapper resting at the very bottom of the ocean, nearly 7 miles beneath the surface, in the single most isolated environment on the entire planet. Human trash had arrived at the deepest point on Earth before humans themselves had properly finished exploring it. Now let's actually go down there. Because to understand what makes the Mariana Trench so genuinely strange, you cannot simply talk about the bottom in isolation. You have to descend through it, layer by layer, the way any dive down into it actually happens. Because the ocean itself changes so radically with depth that scientists divide it into distinct zones, each one stranger and more hostile than the last. The journey begins in what oceanographers call the sunlit zone, the top 200 meters of the ocean, the world most of us picture when we think of the sea at all. This is where sunlight still penetrates enough to support photosynthesis, where the vast majority of ocean life, as most people understand it, actually exists, where fish schools glitter in visible light and coral reefs bloom in shallow, warm water. It feels, relatively speaking, familiar, comfortable, almost gentle. Descend past 200 meters and you enter what is known as the twilight zone, and the character of the ocean begins to shift into something far stranger. Sunlight still exists here, but only barely. A dim blue gloom rather than actual illumination, fading further with every additional meter of depth until, by around 1,000 meters down, it disappears entirely. This is the last layer of the ocean where any trace of surface light survives at all, and the creatures living here have adapted to that fading light in bizarre and specific ways. Many develop enormous eyes to capture every last photon available. Others develop the ability to produce their own light entirely, a phenomenon called bioluminescence, using chemical reactions within their own bodies to produce eerie glowing patterns used for hunting, camouflage, or attracting mates in a world where sunlight is no longer a reliable resource. This is also the layer where many predatory fish begin taking on the alien, nightmarish appearance most people associate with deep-sea creatures. Needle-like teeth too large to fully close inside their mouths, translucent skin revealing the organs beneath, bodies built for ambush and near total darkness rather than for speed or grace. Push further down, past 1,000 meters, and you cross into the midnight zone, and here the last remaining traces of sunlight vanish completely. This is permanent, absolute darkness, the kind that has existed, unbroken, for the entire multi-billion-year history of the Earth's oceans. A darkness so complete that the concept of day and night simply stops applying. Temperatures here hover barely above freezing. Pressure has become genuinely crushing, hundreds of times greater than what you experience standing at sea level. And yet, this zone still teems with life, life that has given up entirely on using vision the way surface animals do. relying instead on bioluminescence, on vibration sensing, on smell, on any sensory tool except the one that depends on a light source that simply does not exist down here anymore. This is the layer of the ocean where the anglerfish lives, the creature whose females dangle a small, glowing lure directly above their own enormous teeth-filled mouths, luring prey close enough in the darkness to strike, an entire hunting strategy built around exploiting the one universal weakness of any creature still instinctively drawn toward light. Below the midnight zone lies the abyssal zone, stretching from around 4,000 meters down to roughly 6,000 meters, an environment so extreme that its very name derives from the ancient Greek word for bottomless, because for most of human history, no one had any real sense of what, if anything, existed beneath it. Life here is sparser, more spread out, existing largely on a slow, constant rain of organic debris, decaying matter drifting down from the layers of ocean far above, an entire ecosystem sustained essentially by scraps falling from a world its inhabitants will never see. And then, finally, below 6,000 meters, in only a handful of locations on the entire planet, mostly within deep ocean trenches exactly like this one, you reach the Hadal zone, named after Hades, the ancient Greek god of the underworld, and the name could not be more fitting. This is the deepest, most extreme, least explored layer of ocean on Earth, existing almost exclusively within trenches like the Mariana, environments so specific and so limited in total surface area across the entire globe that studying them properly requires traveling to one of only a few narrow slivers of ocean floor on the entire planet. Pressure here has become almost incomprehensible, reaching over 1,000 times the pressure you experience at the surface, equivalent to the weight of roughly 50 fully loaded jumbo jets stacked directly on top of a single square meter of surface area. And yet, astonishingly, impossibly, this is where the Mariana Trench's most fascinating and most specifically adapted creatures actually live. Consider the Mariana snailfish, a small, pale, almost translucent creature that holds the current record for the deepest fish ever filmed alive on Earth. Captured on camera by a joint expedition of researchers from the University of Aberdeen and Newcastle University at a depth of over 8,000 meters within the Mariana Trench system. This is not a robust, armored, monstrous-looking predator built to survive extreme conditions through brute physical toughness. It is a small, almost delicate-looking fish, its body soft and gelatinous, its bones thin and only partially developed, seemingly fragile in a way that appears completely at odds with the crushing pressure of its environment. And yet it thrives there specifically because, much like other extreme deep-sea creatures, its body relies on a protective molecule called TMAO, trimethylamine N-oxide, which stabilizes its proteins and cellular structures against the exact kind of pressure that would otherwise destroy them, allowing this small, unassuming fish to hold the depth record for its entire class of animal, living further down than any other fish species ever documented. Alongside the snailfish, the Hadal floor of the Mariana Trench hosts massive swarms of tiny, shrimp-like crustaceans called amphipods, scavenging creatures that gather in astonishing numbers around any organic material that drifts down from the ocean layers above, sometimes appearing in numbers so dense that a single baited camera trap can attract hundreds of them within hours. Researchers studying these amphipods made a discovery that turned out to be quietly disturbing. When they analyzed the tissue of amphipods collected from the deepest part of the Challenger Deep, they found measurable concentrations of industrial pollutants, chemical compounds that had been banned for use in most of the world since the 1970s, meaning that even in the single most isolated environment on Earth, a place separated from human civilization by nearly 7 miles of crushing ocean water, the chemical footprint of human industry had already arrived, carried down slowly over decades by the same falling organic debris that feeds the trench's entire ecosystem. There are also stranger residents down there still, creatures called xenophyophories, single-celled organisms that, remarkably, can grow large enough to be visible to the human eye without any microscope at all, some specimens reaching several centimeters across despite consisting of only a single cell, a fact that continues to challenge basic assumptions about the limits of single-celled life. They exist in some of the highest concentrations ever recorded for this type of organism, specifically within the Hadal depths of trenches like the Mariana, thriving in an environment so extreme that almost nothing about their biology would have been predicted by scientists before deep-sea expeditions actually found them there. What makes all of this so remarkable is not simply that life exists at these depths. It's that for the overwhelming majority of human history, we had virtually no way of knowing any of it was there at all. The technology required to reach the Hadal zone safely, to observe it, to sample it without destroying what you're trying to study, has only existed in any meaningful, repeatable capacity for the last several years, following Victor Vescovo's expeditions. Before that, our entire understanding of the deepest place on Earth rested on a grand total of 2 brief human visits, separated by more than 50 years, and whatever robotic and unmanned equipment scientists could risk sending down in between. We have sent robotic landers to Mars, rovers that have spent years driving across its surface, transmitting thousands of high-resolution images back to Earth. And yet the Challenger Deep, the deepest point on our own planet, went unvisited by any human being for longer than the entire span of the space race, the moon landings, and the first decades of the Space Shuttle program combined. This is perhaps the most genuinely strange thing about the Mariana Trench, stranger even than the creatures living inside it. It is proof that our own planet still holds entire environments, entire ecosystems, entire zones of existence that remain less studied, less visited, and less understood than the surface of a planet 140 million miles away. Every layer you pass through on the way down, from the sunlit shallows to the twilight gloom to the absolute blackness of the midnight zone to the crushing, alien floor of the Hadal depths, represents a step further away from anything resembling the world you and I actually live in. And yet, every single one of those layers is still part of the same planet beneath the same ocean that borders the same coastlines where billions of people live their entire lives without ever considering what exists directly beneath the waves they see every day. The Mariana Trench does not exist on some other world. It exists here, on Earth, closer to most of us than we tend to realize, hidden not by distance but by depth, by pressure, by darkness so total and so ancient that it has kept its secrets from almost the entirety of human history and continues, even now, to reveal them only slowly, one perilous, expensive, and genuinely dangerous descent at a time. If this kind of deep ocean mystery fascinates you the way it fascinates me, make sure you're subscribed, because there is so much more of this planet's hidden world still waiting to be uncovered, and you will not want to miss what we explore next.